pull your chair closer to the fire, because tonight I want to tell you a story about a man who walked into a bar in my hometown of Columbus, Ohio, and was never seen again. It was April 1st, 2006. The city was buzzing with the start of spring. The Ohio State campus alive with weekend noise. Brian Shaffer was 27 years old, a second-year med student with his whole life ahead of him. At 1:55 in the morning, a security camera outside the Ugly Tuna Saloona caught him talking with two young women near the entrance. He smiled, stepped out of the frame, and vanished. No camera ever recorded him leaving. His body was never found. And for 19 years, one of the most baffling missing persons cases in America has remained unsolved. How does a man disappear from a bar packed with people and cameras without a trace? Welcome to this week's mystery on From the Void. Brian Shaffer wasn't just another med student grinding his way through school at Ohio State. He was tall, lanky, with a laid-back smile and that kind of easy charm people remember. Music was his escape. Pearl Jam was his favorite band. So much so that he inked their Stickman logo on his arm. But the spring of 2006 had been a difficult one. Just weeks earlier, Brian's mom had died after a long battle with a rare form of cancer. Friends said he tried to carry on like normal, but there was a heaviness behind his smile. His father, Randy, said Brian wanted to finish medical school to make his mom proud. Even through the grief, Brian had bright spots. He was in love with his girlfriend, Alexis. They were planning to fly to Miami for spring break. The tickets were booked, bags nearly packed. Alexis later said she couldn't imagine Brian just walking away. To her, he was steady, attentive, the kind of guy who called every night just to say he loved her. That Friday night, March 31st, Brian had dinner with his dad, then headed out with friends to unwind. Their night would end in a brand new development, at the time called the South Campus Gateway. And here's where the story needs some history. If you had walked that stretch of High Street in the late 90s or early 2000s, and I did, it was a very different scene. Run-down rentals, cheap bars, a little bit of crime, and plenty for parents to worry about. The area directly across from the campus had a reputation for being unsafe. So the university partnered with a nonprofit developer called Campus Partners to bulldoze and rebuild. Their vision? Turn this notorious stretch into a safe, modern, brightly lit entertainment district. By 2005, the South Campus Gateway was open. Restaurants, shops, apartments, even a movie theater. But in 2006, it was still a work in progress. Reports from that time show dozens of empty storefronts and unleased spaces. Construction wasn't finished. Some corridors were active with nightlife. Others sat quiet, plywood still on the walls. At the top of an escalator on the second floor sat a bar with a strange name, the Ugly Tuna Saloona. It was one of Gateway's very first tenants, and it quickly became a popular late-night stop for Ohio State students. A place that was supposed to symbolize safety and renewal. And yet, on the night Brian Shaffer walked in, the Gateway was still something in between. Polished on the surface, unfinished in the shadows. And that in-between space is where this mystery begins. Friday, March 31st, 2006. The last night anyone saw Brian Shaffer. The evening started simply. As I mentioned previously, he had dinner with his dad, Randy. They talked about school, about his mom, about life after loss. Randy later said he never could have guessed it would be the last time he'd ever see his son. After dinner, Brian met up with his friend and roommate, Clint Florence. The two decided to make a night of it. They went bar hopping through the Short North, one of Columbus's busiest nightlife districts. Not long after midnight, they crossed paths with a friend of Clint's, Meredith Reed. She offered to give them a ride back to the Gateway. Now, for those who don't know Columbus, the Short North is the neighborhood just south of Ohio State, a lively strip of galleries, restaurants, and bars that runs along High Street. It's only about a mile from campus, but at that hour it felt like a world apart. The South Campus Gateway, where the Ugly Tuna was, sat at the very edge of Ohio State's campus, right along High Street from the student housing and lecture halls. So essentially, if you're in the Short North, you just follow High Street north back to campus. So when Meredith drove them from the Short North to the Gateway, it was a short trip, just a few minutes north on High Street. And for Brian and Clint, the Ugly Tuna was the natural last stop. At 1:15 a.m., the three of them were caught on camera riding the escalator up to the second floor of the Gateway complex, heading inside the bar. Brian, in jeans, tennis shoes, and a blue-green striped shirt, disappeared inside the Ugly Tuna Saloona with his friends. For the next 40 minutes, the bar was packed. Music thumping, students packed shoulder to shoulder. Brian mingled, drifted through the room, lost in the chaos of a typical Friday night. Then came 1:55 a.m. The camera caught him again, this time just outside the bar's entrance. He spoke briefly with two women. Witnesses later said he was calm, smiling, relaxed. Moments later, Brian turned away and stepped out of frame, back toward the bar. And that is the last time he was ever seen. When the bar closed, Clint and Meredith assumed Brian had already left. But he hadn't. He never came down the escalator. He never walked past the cameras. It was as if he simply disappeared inside. Here's what makes the disappearance of Brian Shaffer so hard to swallow. The last time we see him on camera is at 1:55 a.m., standing outside the Ugly Tuna, chatting with two women near the entrance. He smiles, turns, and steps back towards the bar. And then, nothing. The Ugly Tuna closed at 2 a.m., just like every bar in Columbus. The lights came on, the music shut down, and the crowd spilled out. That means there were just 5 minutes. 5 minutes between Brian's last appearance on camera and the moment everyone had to start leaving the bar. Investigators watched the tapes over and over. They saw Clint and Meredith leave right around closing. They saw the two women Brian had been speaking with walk out. They saw the crowd empty down the escalator, passing under the unblinking eye of the security camera. But Brian? He never appeared. In those 5 minutes, he had to either walk out unseen, slip into an area not covered by cameras, or somehow remain hidden inside the bar. So police expanded their search through every hallway, every service corridor, even unfinished construction areas. Cadaver dogs swept the building. Officers checked dumpsters, sewers, and nearby work sites. Nothing. It was as if Brian Shaffer vanished into thin air, inside a bar that was supposed to catch every movement on tape. When the Ugly Tuna closed at 2 a.m., Clint and Meredith walked out with the rest of the crowd. They assumed Brian was right behind them. Maybe he'd stopped to say goodbye to someone. Maybe he'd left ahead of them. In the chaos of closing time, it wasn't unusual to lose track of a friend. But Brian never came back to the apartment he shared with Clint. And here's where things get unsettling. Clint didn't raise an alarm. To him, Brian's absence wasn't immediately suspicious. Nights out could be messy. Friends would scatter, and he may have simply thought Brian had ended up somewhere else. But Alexis, Brian's girlfriend, felt differently. She was in Toledo that weekend visiting family, and she noticed the silence. Normally, Brian called her every night. He hadn't called Saturday. He hadn't called Sunday. For Alexis, that was completely out of character. Still, she told herself she'd see him Monday. They were supposed to fly to Miami together for spring break. It was a trip they'd been planning for weeks. But when she waited at the airport, Brian never showed. That was the breaking point. Alexis called his family. His father, Randy, realized something was very wrong. A young man doesn't just vanish before a vacation he's been looking forward to, especially not without a word to the people closest to him. By Monday afternoon, Brian Shaffer was officially reported missing. Police began their search close to home. His car was still parked at his apartment on King Avenue. Inside, nothing looked out of place. No sign of struggle, no sign he'd packed to leave. His credit cards hadn't been touched. And so investigators turned back to the last place he was seen, the South Campus Gateway and the Ugly Tuna Saloona. When Brian was reported missing on Monday, police didn't waste time. Their first step was the apartment, but again, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. For Alexis, those early days were agony. She retraced everything she knew. She told police about their Miami trip, about how Brian had called her just to say he loved her the night he went out. She told reporters it was completely unlike him not to check in. Police focused on the gateway. They pulled security footage, reviewing it frame by frame. Outside the bar, they canvassed the area. They searched dumpsters, alleys, and construction sites. They even went into sewer lines near the gateway. Later, cadaver dogs were brought in to sweep the building. Nothing. Meanwhile, Brian's father, Randy, began his own desperate search. He posted flyers across campus. He stood outside the bar handing them out. He talked to anyone who might have seen his son. He told reporters, "I just want him home." Police widened their net. They searched the Olentangy River that runs alongside campus. They combed through a landfill south of the city on the chance something, anything, might surface. They interviewed dozens of people who had been at the bar that night. Still, nothing. No evidence of foul play, no trace of an accident, no trail of someone walking away. For Randy and Alexis, the silence was unbearable. Alexis said, "It's really hard not having someone you do everything with every day. I just want to find him." But in those first crucial days, there were no leads. Just a young man who went into a bar and never came back out. As detectives dug into the timeline, they focused on the people who had been with Brian that night. First, his friend and roommate, Clint Florence. Clint had spent the evening bar hopping with Brian and returned with him to the Ugly Tuna around 1:15 a.m. After closing, Clint told police he assumed Brian had left ahead of him. He went back to their apartment and didn't see his absence as unusual at the time. When police began asking tougher questions, Clint's attorney advised him not to take a polygraph. He never sat for one. That decision has fueled suspicion for years. But it's important to note, refusing a polygraph is not evidence of guilt. Then there was Meredith Reed, the friend who had given Brian and Clint a ride back to Gateway that night. Meredith cooperated fully. She answered questions, took a polygraph, and passed. She confirmed the timeline. Arrived around 1:15, left at closing, and lost track of Brian somewhere in between. Outside the bar, Brian was last seen talking to two women, Amber and Brighton. Both told investigators the conversation was short, friendly, casual. Brian said goodbye, turned back towards the bar, and stepped out of sight. That was it. Amber later told reporters she was never asked to take a polygraph, but both women were cooperative, and police found nothing in their accounts to suggest they knew more than they said. Dozens of other patrons were interviewed. Security staff, bartenders, people who remembered seeing Brian inside. but no one could explain why the cameras never caught him leaving. In the end, the witnesses gave investigators a tight, consistent timeline. Brian went in at 1:15. He was last seen outside at 1:55. By 2, everyone else was out and Brian was gone. By the summer of 2006, Brian had been missing for months. No new sightings, no activity on his credit cards, no sign of him in Columbus. And then something strange happened. His girlfriend Alexis was still calling his phone almost every day, just to hear it go to voicemail, just to feel close to him. One night in late August, the call didn't go straight to voicemail. This time, the phone actually rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Alexis described the shock of hearing that tone. It made her believe, for just a moment, that Brian might be out there, alive and about to pick up. But then the ringing stopped, and the call went dead. She called again, same thing, ringing, then nothing. When Alexis told investigators, they reached out to his cell provider, Singular. And here's where the mystery hit a wall of technology. In 2006, cell networks often played what's called a false ring. The system would generate the sound of ringing while it searched for the phone, even if the handset was dead, turned off, or long gone. From the caller's end, it felt like the phone was alive. But on the other side, nothing was happening. That night, a cell tower in Hilliard, Ohio, a suburb about 14 miles northwest of Columbus, even registered what looked like a brief signal from Brian's phone. Some saw that as a lead, but investigators and cell experts cautioned that tower logs from that era weren't always reliable. A glitch in the network could make it look like a phone had connected, even if it hadn't. So in the end, the ringing wasn't proof that Brian's phone was turned on. It wasn't proof he was alive. It was just another cruel trick of technology. And for Alexis, it was devastating. She said it felt like losing him all over again. As weeks turned into months, the search for Brian weighed heavily on his family. His father, Randy, refused to give up. He blanketed Columbus with flyers, walked the campus, stood outside the Ugly Tuna handing out pictures of his son. He spoke to anyone who would listen, hoping for the tip that might break the case. But tragedy wasn't finished with the Shaffer family. In September of 2008, just 2 years after Brian disappeared, Randy was working in the yard when a strong windstorm blew through Ohio. A branch snapped, striking him fatally. In the space of 2 years, Brian's younger brother Derek had lost both his mother and his father while still carrying the weight of a brother who had vanished without a trace. And as if the family hadn't suffered enough, there was cruelty too. On an online condolence page set up after Randy's death, someone posted a message claiming to be from Brian. It was said he was living in the Virgin Islands hiding out. Police tracked the post to a public computer in Franklin County. It was a hoax. For Alexis, for Derek, for everyone who loved Brian, it was salt in the wound. Hope dangled, only to be ripped away. By the late 2000s, the case was cold. No confirmed sightings, no new evidence, just unanswered questions, and a family forced to live in the shadow of what might have been. 19 years later, we're still left with theories, and each one circles back to the same question. How does a man walk into a bar and never walk out? Let's start with the most obvious. Theory 1, an accident in the gateway. Like we said earlier, the gateway wasn't finished in 2006. Dozens of units were still empty. Construction areas were active behind the scenes. There were service doors, stairwells, corridors not covered by cameras. Some believe Brian slipped into one of those blind spots. Maybe he wandered into a restricted area. Maybe he fell. Police even searched dumpsters, construction sites, and nearby sewer lines. They dragged the Olentangy River. They combed a landfill. And yet, no trace. At one point, people even speculated he might have fallen into wet cement, entombed during the construction itself. But here's the problem with that theory. By spring of 2006, the gateway's major construction was complete. The foundations, the concrete work, that was finished the year prior. What was happening when Brian disappeared was mostly fit-out work. Drywall, painting, wiring, tenant build-outs. Police searched every corner they could access. They sent cadaver dogs through the building. They checked all around it. If Brian had died inside the gateway, investigators believe that they would have found him. On one hand, the unfinished state of the building did give him places to go unseen. Blind spots and service corridors could explain why he never appeared on camera again. But then again, the construction wasn't the kind that could swallow someone whole. And with the scale of the searches, dogs, dumpsters, sewers, river, landfill, it seems almost impossible that his body could have been missed. So theory number 2, the hidden exit, service door. So here's another theory, one that tries to solve the no exit on camera problem. To understand how Brian could vanish without a trace, you have to picture the layout of the Ugly Tuna itself. The only public way in or out was the escalator from High Street. A fixed security camera at the top was supposed to capture every single person who passed through. And that's why his disappearance is so baffling. Brian never appeared leaving that way. But there was another door. Like most bars and restaurants, the Ugly Tuna had a service exit, a back door meant for employees, deliveries, and maintenance. That door didn't lead to High Street. Instead, it opened into the guts of the gateway, service corridors and unfinished spaces not covered by cameras. Police acknowledged this as a possible escape route. A panning camera elsewhere in the complex sometimes swept past that area, but it wasn't constant. If Brian went through the service door at the right moment, he could have slipped into those hallways without ever being recorded. This explanation makes sense of the paradox. The last time Brian was seen, he turned back toward the bar after talking to 2 women outside. If he re-entered the Ugly Tuna, he could have walked through that service door instead of down the escalator. So one thing for this theory is that the service exit was real. It connected to areas of gateways still under construction, and it was plausible that the cameras missed him. But against this theory is the lingering question of why. Why would Brian use an employee exit instead of walking out the front? Accident? Intention? Or something more sinister? Which brings us to theory 3, voluntary disappearance. This is another theory that Brian left by choice. He was grieving his mother. He was exhausted by medical school. He sometimes talked about living by the ocean, chasing music instead of medicine. His girlfriend Alexis adored him, but friends knew he carried a restlessness inside. So could Brian have used that night to walk away? For that theory says the grief, the stress, the desire for a new life could possibly explain a decision to start over. And the fact that no body has ever been found keeps the possibility alive. Against this theory is Brian had a spring break trip planned to Miami, booked with Alexis just days later. He also left his car, his wallet, and his keys. His credit cards were never touched. His phone never turned on again. For a man planning to vanish, he left nothing prepared. Which brings us to theory 4, foul play. He was last seen outside talking with 2 women. Witnesses say the conversation was friendly. Afterward, he turned back toward the bar and disappeared. Could something have happened inside those final minutes? A fight? An attack? A confrontation out of view of the cameras? One thing for this theory is the timing window was razor thin. Just 5 minutes between his last sighting and closing time. If anything happened, it had to happen fast. And the fact that he never appeared on camera leaving suggests he didn't walk out normally. But against this theory is no one inside the bar reported a struggle. There was no blood, no evidence. In a crowded room at closing time, it would have been hard to hide violence. And yet, it can't be ruled out. Theory 5, the smiley face killer. Some believe Brian's case fits into a larger pattern of young men across the Midwest found dead near bodies of water. Cases linked controversially to a supposed serial killer or killers. On one hand, Brian fits the profile. College-aged, male, last seen at a bar. The Olentangy River isn't far from campus. Against this theory, though, is that the Columbus police and the FBI have dismissed the connection. No evidence has ever linked Brian to those deaths. And unlike many of the supposed smiley face victims, Brian's body has never been found. In the end, every theory circles back to the same haunting truth. Accident, hidden exit, voluntary disappearance, foul play, serial killer. Everyone seems possible until you look closer, and then it falls apart. Just like Brian Shaffer slipping out of sight, leaving only questions. 19 years later, the questions remain. We don't know how Brian left the Ugly Tuna without showing up on camera. We don't know why his phone rang months later, or whether the Hilliard ping meant anything at all. We don't know if he was taken, if he walked away, or if something terrible happened inside those unfinished corridors. What we do know is that he never made his flight to Miami. He never used his bank cards. He never turned on his phone again. And the one person still fighting hardest to keep this case alive is his younger brother, Derek. After losing his mother and then his father in that freak accident, Derek is the one left searching. He's the one who still speaks to reporters, the one who refuses to let Brian be forgotten. Even today, nearly 2 decades later, billboards go up around Columbus, asking for tips, asking for information, asking for someone to finally break the silence. The case is still open. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation has Brian listed on its missing persons database. The FBI VICAP program keeps his file active, and the Columbus Division of Police continues to ask for tips. So if you know anything, no matter how small, you can call Columbus Police Department at 614-645-2358 or the FBI VICAP line at 1-800-634-4097. Because until someone comes forward, Brian Shaffer's story will remain one of the most enduring unsolved mysteries. And so the fire burns low, and our story comes to a close. A young man walks into a bar in Columbus, Ohio, and never walks out. No trace, no answers, only theories, shadows, and silence. Nearly 2 decades have passed, and still his brother keeps the search alive. Billboards go up, flyers are handed out, a family's hope flickers, refusing to die out completely. But until the truth is found, Brian Shaffer remains out there somewhere, caught between memory and mystery. Until next time, thank you for joining me by the fire for another story on From the Void.